Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody. We're going to talk about getting teachers in the hard-to-staff schools. This is work with Steve Rifkin and a group of other people that are hardworking, able people, but weren't invited here. So I have to give the title again. Steve wouldn't let me put the title on the paper, but what this is paper about is performance-based combat pay. And it's interesting to talk about this today because maybe tomorrow or next week, Denver is going to go on strike about whether you pay extra amounts to people who work in difficult to teach in schools. And what we're going to talk about is how Dallas has done this in a very different way, and a different way than Denver. And we're going to talk about the effects of it. So some of you have been here in the past and heard us talk about the way Dallas has changed its personnel system for both principals and teachers. There's something called the Principal Excellence Initiative and the Teacher Excellence Initiative, which in 2013 and 2015 basically did away with experience and degree levels to pay teachers and to evaluate where they are. But they went to a very elaborate evaluation system that is completely throughout the entire personnel system now. And our larger work is to try to evaluate the whole thing, which it turns out to be more difficult than the little part that we're going to evaluate today. But the little part we're going to evaluate today, I think, has huge implications for Denver and other cities. When they put in this system, one of the concerns was that if you were assigned to a difficult school, your evaluations would be lower and you would be hurt. And so they're trying to protect against that in part. But it's much more interesting to look at also what happens to the kids in these schools when you change it. So in 2015-16, Dallas chose what is probably their worst 7 schools out of 230 schools or so. They chose their worst 7 schools, and they put in new principals in all of these schools, and they largely replaced the entire teaching force. And they did it in a very systematic way. One is that they gave bonuses for coming in, which sort of looks like Denver ProComp. But secondly, they gave variable size salary bonuses depending upon your rating in the prior year. So that if you were a good teacher, you got a big increase in your salaries. And if you were a more middle of the road teacher, you got an increase, but lower. And so this is partly the question, do teachers respond to incentives? And we're going to show you that answer here. Then more recently, they added 6 more schools to this whole picture so that there's 13 altogether that got this treatment. Now, any teacher who was in the schools prior to the program who was not rated as effective, which is basically in the top 2/3 or top 60% of the total distribution of performance, was sent away. And I'll say now everybody's asking, well, what happened? Where'd they go and so forth? Well, we don't have that quite yet, but what we do have is what happens in these schools. You got salary increases if you were a top teacher of $8,000 a year in your salary increase for going to these schools, and principals got $12,000 a year. That was good. And every year you were given bonuses based upon your prior year salary, so there were some incentives to do a good job. What goes into these ratings first? The ratings are a comprehensive system that in part have a correlation with the impact system in DC or so on. There's student achievement scores if they're available. So you'll use some value-added measures if they're available. Everybody has performance measures based upon principles evaluation of the teacher and other people. There's multiple ratings. And then they actually also include some survey information from students and families into their rating system. Now, teachers have different components of this. If you don't have the achievement scores, if you're not in the right grade subject, you rely on the other ones. But there's a very systematic way that this is all done. Then what happens is with the ACE systems. The key to this is, in our evaluation, is that Dallas has defined another set of schools as near ACE. In other words, crummy but not the worst is the way to think about this. And so they, in some sense, provide a natural comparison group to our ACE schools, and we can see what happens over time in those schools compared to our ACE schools. And when you think about the ACE system, there's a whole series of arguments in the literature of what's going on, from schools with very disadvantaged schools tend to get lower quality teachers as based upon achievement. The salary supplements for educators in disadvantaged raises retention and achievement. We know that's part of what's going on. The third thing is that there's some argument that well-done professional development helps. And then fourthly, there is some argument that, in fact, having better peers helps. The interesting thing about ACE schools is that we don't distinguish among all of these for the most part. We've got a little bit of evidence, but that ACE schools tries to take care of all of these issues simultaneously. Now, here's the answer. This is a one-slide paper in some sense, but we'll stretch it out, of course, because I have more time. But this is in simplest terms the entire answer here. What you have, let me identify them. The sort of light green line that's sort of horizontal in the middle are these near ACE schools, the ones that are not very good, but they don't get any treatment. And in the blue line is the ACE wave of schools, and you see that when the program came into effect in 2015, and you follow after 2015, that the near ACE and the wave 1 schools look like they're all following nice in a nice pattern, and then 2015 comes and they're hit with this treatment of new teachers, new principals, and all of a sudden the ACE schools have jumped ahead of the near ACE schools, and they're in fact approaching the top is the everybody else line, and they're starting to approach that. And then the orange line is just the wave 2. So we're going to do two comparisons here of wave 1 schools to near ACE and wave 2 schools to near ACE. But you see the answer. You know, I'm going to fill in the details with stars and all that stuff, but this is the answer. These are the math scores. And what you see is a dramatic change, at least for the first 3 years of the wave 1 schools. So, you know, there's some technical details about whether they're the pre-existing trends, whether there were differences in the trends beforehand. There aren't for wave 1 schools. There are a little bit for wave 2 schools in that picture, but it really doesn't matter. These, you can adjust for those, and it doesn't matter. Here's the reading scores. The reading scores, we're going to do the same comparison. The green near ACE schools and the blue wave 1 schools 2015, you have this jump up with the new program. And then you have the wave 2 to the near ACE schools that jump up when they get the program after 2017. And you see that in both cases, these wave 1 and wave 2 ACE schools are dusting the near ACE schools in terms of performance, and they're starting to look like an average Dallas school. Not so much in reading, there's less effects in reading, but in math, you see these dramatic effects. So let me give you a little details. I mean, the same summary here. You have smaller increases, and in fact, the wave 2 schools jumped up a lot in their first year, or jumped ahead of the wave 1 schools, but it's all within the same range. And the picture is what you have to have in the back of your mind. So we can control for differences in student demographics. We can look at estimates, we can look at student controls versus no student controls. These are the regression estimates of a difference in difference model, which we're estimating, where we have whether they're an ACE school or not, whether the year is earlier than the program comes into effect or it's afterwards, and then the interaction gives you the impact of the ACE program in that year. There's I should say there's a problem with producing this table because it's wave 2 schools start in different times, so it's not really ACE times year greater than 2016. It's ACE times after the program went into effect. But I didn't know how to write that on a slide, so I've used the wrong labels. But what you get here is that the first 2 columns for wave 1 gives you with and without student controls, and that has no impact. You get exactly the same results for the impact of ACE schools. The same with wave 2. You get the same result whether you control for the student demographics or not. So everything is looking like like ACE schools have a big impact. Same for reading. Okay. When we look at the schools, and I'll quickly go over this, we have different categories of demographic factors from income through special education and so forth, and the different groups. And these are the change in those demographic factors from before to after the introduction of ACE, and you see that they're all small numbers. So the schools are the same. There's no change there. What is the change? Let me see if I can get to it. What is the change is what the principals and teachers look like. That's the intervention. So on the left-hand column here is the share of principals according to the rating system. And effective means there are 5 or 6 different categories of ratings for teachers and principals, and effective is roughly the top 60% of they're proficient in different levels, and exemplary are added together. And the way to look at the principal one on the left-hand side is that before the ACE program went into effect, there were no effective principals in ACE schools. And the intervention then convinced, coerced, bribed, whatever, some effective teachers principals to go into these bad schools, and you end up with the left-hand column is the ACE schools, and 70% of the principals are then effective just at the introduction, and that was a big part of the intervention. The right-hand side is the share of effective teachers. And if you look again at the left 2 columns, the blue and the red columns, those are the ACE schools. And they start out with 29% effective teachers, and then that jumps up to 72% effective teachers when the program comes into effect. That's how we interpret these results, frankly, that you got better personnel into the system, and they were effective. That's it. What else do we want to say? I don't know what. These are teacher performance. These are how much did teacher performance go up. The first row gives you the effect of the intervention on the quality of the teachers, whether you have effective teachers and you have this big jump. The last column is interesting, and you see that the first column has no controls for teacher or principal characteristics. The second column and third column have controls for the experience and degrees and so forth of principals and teachers. The final column is what you get if you put in teacher fixed effects. And what you see in there is that almost all the program intervention goes away when you take into account the quality of the teachers as seen by teacher fixed effects. So we interpret this in a rough sense as saying, for the most part, it's teacher selection and not the other peer effects and not the nurturing of teachers and so forth. Although all in both reading and math in different ways, you'll see that there's a positive residual, just not statistically significant. So it says there might be some of these other factors going on at the same time. Same thing here for these are only teachers with tested students, so that some of the teachers were not evaluated on test performance because they weren't in the right grades or subjects. But if you just look at the ones that are tested, you get exactly the same kind of answer from the value added, sort of more quantitative evaluation component. Same thing here. So what else do we have? We have survey information about teachers, whether they were supportive or not. And what we saw was that the ACE program, again, the first line is the impact of the ACE program. And, you know, you get some positive impact on survey information that they were more supportive, but it's not a huge, big number. Is the point. No problem. Then we have, what do we say about this? I think I've said it all. This is a summary table that basically says that it looks like teacher quality matters, surprising, and that you can induce good teachers to go to poor environments. Yes. Not surprising to some, not to all. And when they go there, they're still good teachers and they have an impact on student performance. That's what we, I think, have said. There's a chart here that I'm taking advantage of the fact that Dan said I don't have much time, so it's too complicated to actually explain. So I'll go on. What do I say? The summary. I think it's that one picture is the full summary of everything. It says that if you get good personnel into the schools, which you can do with incentives, it matters. And so unlike the long history of work and attempts to use combat pay, like in Denver and so forth, where you say anybody who wants to go to my school can get $4,000, and we've got very mixed results from that because, again, the standard economic theorem, bad teachers like more money as much as good teachers, and so you end up with an average teacher following the $4,000, and you end up with no effect. So if the objective is really to try to improve these very bad schools, you want to make sure that they have the best personnel there. And once you do that, it works. That's the whole summary.